Know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GBNews.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Rishi Sunak to face down Sir Keir Starmer at midday today. Yes, it's Prime Minister's questions, but there's so much going on elsewhere too. Not only are the strikes crippling this country, but also we're going to speak to the MP for the spaceport, which didn't quite see the first successful launch of a satellite from European soil. That, and an exclusive interview with Jacob Rees-Mogg, where he doesn't hold back. Catch it all after the headlines.
Tom, thank you. Good morning. I'm Tatiana Sanchez in the GB newsroom. Thousands of ambulance workers across England and Wales are going on strike today in a dispute over pay. Up to 25,000 paramedics, drivers and call handlers from the Unison and GMB unions are taking part in staggered walkouts across a 24-hour period. A further day of action is planned for the 23rd of this month. Health Secretary Steve Barclay told us, despite contingency plans, there will be an impact on patient responses.
Saying to people, if they do face genuine life-threatening issues, then of course the response is to phone 999, but if not, then to be very mindful of the pressure on the system today. Clearly there's 111, which is there for urgent calls, but we're just asking people to be mindful of the significant pressure our ambulance service will be under today.
Well, teachers in Scotland are striking for a second day today after last-ditch talks failed to find a solution. Secondary schools across Scotland will be closed following primary schools being shut yesterday. The Scottish Teaching Union has demanded a 10% pay increase, but the Scottish Government only offered 5%. The Prime Minister and his Japanese counterpart will sign a landmark defence agreement today that will allow the UK and Japan to deploy forces into each other's countries. The treaty, which Rishi Sunak and Fumio Kishida will sign, will make the UK the first European country to have mutual access with Japan. It's part of a foreign policy tilt towards the Indo-Pacific region against a growing threat from China. TV, online and DAB Plus radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Tom.
Good morning, it's 9:34 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Well, first this morning, our Home and Security editor Mark White joins us in the studio for some breaking news from Paris. Mark, what's going on?
This was a knife attack at the Gare du Nord International Rail Station in the heart of Paris this morning at about 6:45, just as that station was very, very busy with people beginning to commute to wherever. An attacker brandishing a knife attacked and stabbed 6 people, one of those in a critical condition, we're told, in hospital. The attacker himself was subdued by 2 off-duty police officers who just finished a night shift, were heading home. They apparently, some of them carry weapons. Luckily for them, they were able to, in French parlance, neutralise the attacker. He was shot, we're told, 3 times. Wow. He's seriously injured and is in hospital.
This sounds very dramatic in a station that many British people will know quite well. Of course, Gare du Nord is where the Eurostar comes in. What are the motivations behind this attack, can we suspect? Might this be, we have seen a number of attacks of this kind that are linked to terror?
Yes, I mean, the first thing you think about with a multiple attack like this is terror, and that's uppermost in the thinking of French officials. For the time being, it's still being handled by the French criminal prosecutor, but in the fullness of time, it may well be handed over to the anti-terror prosecutor, depending on what they find. Still, obviously, in the very early stages. But you're right, this is a very busy station, lots of Brits. You were telling me that you yourself had been through this very station in recent days as well. The Eurostar terminal is there. So as a consequence, of course, lots of people from this country get on trains there and come off trains there. Paris itself at the moment is on a heightened state of alert because remember last month we had that terrible gun attack at a Kurdish community centre in the 10th arrondissement, not far at all from Gare du Nord station. Now, we don't know if these 2 incidents are in any way linked at all, but that again will be factored into the thinking of the police as they go forward. But that sparked riots, as you can see on the screen there, in the aftermath of that shooting. Tensions have been high ever since, and police have been braced for the possibility of perhaps reprisal attacks. We don't know if it is.
Well, we will keep a very close eye on this as it develops. Of course, a developing station there in Paris, in the Gare du Nord station. Mark White, thank you. But turning now to domestic politics, where, of course, Prime Minister's Questions is taking place at midday today. No doubt political leaders may well mention that attack in Paris at the start. They often do talk about timely events at the beginning of those questions. But then it moves on to the substantive politics, the Punch and Judy politics, some might describe it as. Well, what on earth might be asked today? I'm delighted to be joined by Ben Glaze, the Deputy Political Editor at The Mirror. And Sir Keir Starmer has to go on strikes, I would suspect.
Yeah, you'd think so. With ambulance staff and call handling staff from 909 ambulance services walking out today in a series of strikes up and down the country, Keir Starmer won't be able to avoid that. Now, the government will obviously point to the minimum service legislation that it's introduced into Parliament yesterday, which will affect ambulance, fire and rail staff and oblige unions to provide a minimum service during industrial action. Now, Rishi Sunak will be hoping to sort of throw it back on Keir Starmer, saying, well, does Labour support this? And we saw yesterday in the House, Labour doesn't support the legislation, of course. But Keir Starmer, it's what everyone's talking about, is the strike. So, yeah, the Labour leader will be obliged, I'd have thought, to raise that at noon at Prime Minister's Questions.
It's a tricky position for the Labour Party, of course, because whilst some strikes carry huge public support, other strikes, we're seeing public support almost ebb away, particularly when it comes to train drivers and the like. Does Labour need to take a more nuanced position here?
I think the polling does show that the public is still on the side of the NHS staff taking industrial action, but it has sort of waned slightly when it comes to employees on the railways. So, yeah, it is more important, I think, for Keir Starmer to perhaps try and divorce those two and use perhaps separate lines of attack. Also, when you look at the legislation that will affect fire, ambulance and railway staff, well, if it's protecting lives that it's about, well, that applies obviously to ambulance and the fire brigades. It doesn't necessarily apply to the railways.
Well, you mentioned the railways. It's interesting because the Transport Select Committee is currently sitting. I believe we can dip in briefly to what is going on at this Transport Select Committee, where I'm told we have senior union leaders. Let's have a listen.
The Free Trade Union signed up to an enabling agreement with them. Part of that enabling agreement, of course, was that certain parts of the railway were excluded from severance, including signal persons, guards and drivers. I received a deal telling me that there's going to be no compulsory redundancies till 2024. Also, the deal told us what our people would do, where we would negotiate, and broke the arrangements within the enabling agreement about how we would cascade any broad brush agreement we might have made at a national level. My board, my executive committee, will deal with that next Monday. I'm naturally being questioned all the time on what my view on that deal is. I'm incredibly open. I cannot recommend any one element of it, and it may destroy the ability to go back to those talks in future.
Okay, well, we'll delve into some of these points, and obviously we've got the other side of the table coming to us in just under an hour's time. But can I hand over to Paul? You want to
thank you, Chair.
The next question.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I don't envy anybody trying to do any of these sort of negotiations right in the public domain, which you guys have to. But just in terms of...
Well, there we have it, a bit of the Transport Select Committee. We'll bring you some highlights from that committee as union leaders talk to those politicians about exactly what's going on our transport infrastructure. But let's just move on for one moment now to another subject, because yesterday I sat down with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Our conversation ranged from the urgent need to get EU law off our statute books, recent conversations he's had with Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, and his attitude towards the Sunak ministry, ditching so many of those pro-growth policies promoted by his predecessor. Well, today, we are delighted to be able to show some clips of this interview, which will be shown in full tomorrow. Jacob Rees-Mogg hits out particularly at the way the Bank of England failed to control inflation and contributed to the downfall of Liz Truss. Looking then at sort of your time in government, do you think that there were many mistakes made under Liz Truss as Prime Minister? Clearly, you agree with the intentions, but that crucial point at which the markets lost confidence in the United Kingdom, for a Conservative government to be at the helm at that point, what was the major mistake?
Well, of course, mistakes are always made. It's part of the human condition to make mistakes. Perfection is not within the human gift. There was a concatenation of circumstances that meant that the financial statement in late September 2022 had consequences that led to the end of that government pretty quickly. It coincided with the Bank of England failing to raise interest rates enough and being slow in dealing with the inflationary problem. I mean, an independent Bank of England has one task, to keep inflation at 2%. It has manifestly failed at that task. That is not the government, that is the independent Bank of England. As a minister, we all had to pretend the Bank of England was doing marvellously. Well, it wasn't. It's an institution that has let the country down. But because the government was covering up for the Bank of England, it took all the blame for difficulties in the financial markets, which was partly the government's fault, but not entirely.
Of course, there were those that said that interest rates should have been raised. Patrick Minford was one during that leadership campaign over the summer. But of course, now the big political issue is that mortgage rates are up. Isn't that a consequence of raising rates?
Yes, of course it is. But if you've got inflation, you've got to raise interest rates. I mean, inflation is such a problem, you can't just pretend it's not there and not raise rates. What the Bank of England shouldn't have done was the final stage of quantitative easing during the pandemic, which added fuel to the fire and added a certain amount to the inflation rate. And going back further, it should have been normalising interest rates in the 20-teens.
Extraordinary words there about the Bank of England having let the country down, in his words. Well, in our wide-ranging conversation, Jacob Rees-Mogg also called on the government to modernise the planning system which he says is holding back the growth of the UK.
Through what was called the growth plan under Liz Truss, which had a number of pieces of supply-side reform within it, whether it was reform to childcare, to planning, to migration, all of these areas. And it seems to me that almost every single one has been ditched by this current government. Is that an issue? Is that going to hurt our growth prospects?
Well, the planning issue is one that has been holding back the growth of this country for some time. We have a socialist planning system based on a late 1940s Planning Act, which thinks that central government can predict and plan the amount of building that we need. And we actually know from history that these centrally directed targets don't work, they don't provide the housing that people need. Government is not omniscient in that sense. It doesn't actually know what is going to be needed, whereas the market can provide. And I've thought for some time we need to move to a more market-based planning system. We need to free up the planning laws. And I think voters are ahead of politicians in this. I think they are ready for planning reform because they want their children and their grandchildren to be able to buy properties, which they can't at the moment.
Really interesting stuff there. The full 20-minute interview will be played out on this show tomorrow morning, so do tune in for that, where Jacob ReesMogg, amongst other things, talks about recent conversations he's had with Liz Truss and indeed Boris Johnson. So some interesting things to listen to there. But let's return to the question of Prime Minister's questions now, because Graham Stringer, the Labour MP, is joining us now. Of course, he'll be sitting behind the Leader of the Opposition from midday. Thank you for joining us there from College Green, Graham. I suppose one big question is, what on earth would you want your party leader to focus on from midday?
Today, I think I agree with your original analysis. There is so much happening in the country that inevitably the Leader of the Opposition has to talk about the mess the government have created, both in the economy and the fact that they expect workers in the health service, workers in transport and elsewhere to carry on doing their stressful, vital jobs at effectively 20% less income than they had 10 years ago. And a lot of the reasons that they aren't being paid as much is the huge quantities of money the government wasted during the COVID epidemic, as well as other major failures of the economy. I've just listened to Jacob ReesMogg saying the Bank of England got inflation wrong. They did. I agree with him there. But I don't agree with his defence of Liz Truss. You don't go when you need to borrow money, which she wanted to borrow money, and be extremely rude to the bank manager, and she was extremely rude to the markets, and we're all paying the price for those two major economic failures, and that is at root cause why people aren't being paid a fair wage at the moment.
That's really interesting. Before we return to the strikes, just on that Bank of England question, would you be supportive of some Bank of England reform? Because it does seem that this is an institution that has almost lost its way. It's got a target of keeping inflation to 2%. Of course, it was almost 10 points over that target for some time in recent months.
I think the Bank of England has suffered from poor leadership over the last 6 or 7 years. As you say, it hasn't done what it is supposed to do, keep inflation under control. The Bank of England was given independence by Gordon Brown within a few days of the general election in 1997 to reassure the markets that a Labour government coming in, when there'd not been a Labour government for 18 years, wouldn't mess about with the economy. That was a good reason at the time. Now, I think, taking interest rates, taking all the responsibilities of the Bank of England has now, which they didn't used to have, I think some of those responsibilities should come back to central government because the Bank of England, as Jacob ReesMogg said, has failed pretty abysmally.
Really, really interesting stuff there coming from two sides of the political spectrum. The idea that the Bank of England might be almost too independent. I want to get back to this question of strikes, however, Graham Stringer, because do you think that your party leader might have dug in too hard here on minimum safety, minimum service levels? These, of course, are laws that exist in Spain, in Italy, in France. Why can't they exist in the United Kingdom?
In one sense, those similar laws do exist in the United Kingdom. At the start of the last century, the police were banned from having an independent trade union and were told they couldn't go on strike. So that barrier was passed then. But if you want to ask workers to provide a particular level of service in emergencies when they're on strike, you have to negotiate it. But the government are doing exactly what they've done on wages, saying we know best and we're going to force this on you. It's not a sensible way to behave with vital services and people who are committed professionally to doing their job as well as they can. This is just the wrong way to go about any change. And there is at the bottom of it, of course, a fundamental right for people to withdraw their labour. If you're going to, in some cases, as I've just mentioned, the police, change that, then you have to do it by agreement in a de minimis, in a very small way indeed, not telling workers that they have to work when they've decided to withdraw their labour. Because if they still withdraw the labour, are the government going to put health workers, ambulance workers and other vital workers in prison? We went through this in the 1970s. It doesn't work. You need negotiation by consent, and you need fair resolution of issues, and asking people to work for 20% less is not fair.
Well, Graham Stringer, it's certainly going to be a spicy debate later in Parliament. We'll keep our eyes absolutely peeled to those green benches. For now, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing this morning. Really appreciate your time. Let's return now to Ben Glaze, the Deputy Political Editor of the Daily Mirror. What did you make there of what Graham Stringer was saying, almost in agreement with Jacob Rees-Mogg, this question of the political independence of the Bank of England?
Yeah, it's been 25 years now since the Bank of England got its independence in those early days of the new Labour government. And for many years, that worked fine. Nobody had a problem with it. But then, round about sort of after the economic crisis started to alleviate in the sort of early 2010s, backbencher called Jacob Rees-Mogg was on the Treasury Select Committee, and he started ripping into the governor of the Bank of England at the time, Mark Carney, about quantitative easing, the printing of money, tens of billions of pounds, that some MPs, including Jacob Rees-Mogg, thought would stoke inflation. Of course, the inflationary pressures we're dealing with at the moment, they can't all be traced back to, quantitative easing. There's the bounce back from COVID and, of course, the war in the Ukraine. But some of them can be attributed to that, as Jacob Rees-Mogg said. But one thing I thought was interesting that he conveniently forgot in that interview with you was the chaos that Liz Truss inflicted with that £47 billion unfunded tax cut budget that Kwasi Kwarteng unveiled in September, which directly led to the higher mortgage costs that homeowners are paying at the moment. And as, of course, a key member of that cabinet, Jacob Rees-Mogg had a key role in that.
Yes, it's interesting. He was perhaps saying that wouldn't have been so jittery for markets if the Bank of England had raised rates earlier. But, of course, they didn't, and the government did it anyway. So I think that is a fair point you raise. I wonder, though, on the broader spectrum of this all, there are questions of splits within the Conservative Party. We saw Boris Johnson speak at the Carlton Club last night. Jacob Rees-Mogg was critical to some extent of Rishi Sunak moving away from the pro-growth agenda of Liz Truss. Where does this all end? Can you see a route for Boris Johnson to return?
I don't think there is a route for Boris Johnson to return. There are local elections coming up in May. That's really the key time for Rishi Sunak, because the Conservatives, polls suggest they're going to get absolutely hammered in those local elections. That's the danger moment for the Prime Minister, because Boris Johnson's supporters, both in the backbenches and in the Conservative constituency associations, they'll start to rally then and point to, look, there's a proven election winner, a man who a few years back got us an 80-seat majority, widely acknowledged as the best political campaigner of his generation. only he can win a general election again in 2024. That's what they'll be saying. But the Tory parliamentary party, the reason Boris Johnson went was because he couldn't find enough MPs to serve in his government. That hasn't changed. Rishi Sunak has brought stability to government. It's become a little bit boring. But Boris Johnson, he's just so divisive, and there's opposition to him within the Conservative Parliamentary Party. I don't see a way back for him.
Really, really interesting stuff, something that no doubt we will be following with great, great interest as the weeks and months develop. But finally today, away from the sort of intra-party or inter-party political punch-up, of course, on Monday, Britain's first space launch from our own soil failed to make it to orbit. 9 satellites were lost. And one person who was there to witness that historic first attempt to launch satellites from European soil was the Member of Parliament for Newquay, the site of the launch where one of the UK's 7 spaceports are based. Steve Double joins us now from College Green. And Steve, were you disappointed with how this launch went?
Good morning, Tom. Yes, clearly the end result was not what we hoped for. Everything up until that point went perfectly. We got the plane up, the rocket was launched from the plane, everything appeared to be going perfectly well, and then at that final stage of separation something went wrong, which meant the rocket wasn't able to get into the orbit it needed to be in to release those satellites. So although very disappointing in the end result, from a Spaceport Cornwall point of view, everything went really well right up until that point.
Now, of course, you're part of a group of people who worked tirelessly to get this launch off the ground, if you'll pardon the pun. Does this mean that we will see another launch in fairly short order? How quickly can this all get going again?
Absolutely. This was the culmination of 8 years of hard work and campaigning by a large group of people across many different organisations to get us to this point. But absolutely, this is not the end of the story. Everyone I speak to is absolutely determined that we will go again as quickly as possible, hopefully later this year, and try again to get those satellites into the right orbit. This is a long-term project. This wasn't just a one-off. We know these things can happen in space. Putting satellites in space is difficult. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it. So there is a real determination to make sure that this is not the end of the story, and we will go again as soon as possible.
Now, of course, Newquay, your patch, is one of the 7 spaceports that the United Kingdom has. 4 of them are these horizontal launch pads, as we saw in Newquay. 3 of them are vertical launch pads, mostly up in Scotland. My question to you, Steve, is will Newquay now be beaten in the race by one of the other 6 launch pads, or will it be Newquay that takes the crown after all for the first European launch of a satellite?
Well, just to slightly correct you there, Tom, I mean, Newquay is at the moment the only operational spaceport in the UK. We know that they are developing in Scotland, in Shetland, for a vertical launch site as well. But as far as I'm aware, there are no other advanced plans for a horizontal launch site yet in the UK. Newquay is the only one. We made history in Newquay this week by getting that rocket into space. But absolutely, I believe that the UK wants to be a significant player in the international global space sector, and in order to do that we need to have launch capability, and there is room for both vertical and horizontal launch capabilities to cater for different needs for different types of satellites, and I believe Newquay will still into the future have a significant part to play in providing that horizontal launch capability to get those smaller satellites which much of the market is now shifting to into orbit.
Well, Steve Double, thank you for joining us here on The Briefing, and best of luck to you and everyone at Newquay for that second attempt launch, hopefully sooner rather than later. Thanks for joining us. Well, that's it for the programme today. Coming up, it's Bev Turner Today, so stick around for that.